Is it an ill wind that's fueling an escalating row between Edinburgh and London over subsidies for wind farms? Accused. The SNP are demanding a U-turn from the UK government over their policy of ending subsidies to onshore wind farms. Nicola Sturgeon has written to David Cameron, saying wind farms create jobs and bring cash into Scotland, as well as helping the country to meet its climate change targets. So, is he likely to change his mind? More than 2,500 wind turbines are dotted across Scotland's landscape. They've been paid for in part by us, through a levy on household fuel bills. According to government figures, more than £800 million was paid out for onshore wind farm subsidies last year. But this will end next April, a year earlier than originally planned. The Scottish Government is not happy about that decision. The First Minister has written to David Cameron urging the Prime Minister to rethink.
The action that his government are taking on wind farms is anti-business, it's anti the environment, and it will have a disproportionate effect on Scotland. 70% of all wind farms in planning and development are here in Scotland. Now, I don't agree with his policy full stop, but if he's determined to go ahead, then he needs to think very carefully about the phasing of the introduction if he's not to have a seriously bad effect on not just the environment and our ability to meet energy needs in Scotland and across the UK, but also on business.
The Scottish Government failed to meet its own ambitious emissions target again this year. If the removal of the subsidy leads to a reduction in wind farm developments, meeting it in future could prove even more difficult. But wind turbines do divide opinion, particularly large-scale onshore wind farms, and some have welcomed the decision to cut the subsidies early. The anti-wind farm group Scotland Against Spin said,
"The cut in subsidies for new wind farms is long overdue. Rural Scotland is breathing a huge sigh of relief that the Conservatives are sticking to their manifesto pledge."
A UK government spokesperson said it was a top priority to tackle climate change, but they also said they were determined to help industries and technologies stand on their own 2 feet, not to encourage a reliance on public subsidies. Well, I'm joined now from Aberdeen by Callum McCaig, who heads the SNP's Westminster Group on Energy and Climate Change. And in Dundee, we've got the Scottish Conservatives energy spokesman, Murdo Fraser. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Callum McCaig, do you really think that the First Minister can persuade the Prime Minister to change his policy?
I would like to think so. I think, as we've heard in the package there, this is having a hugely disproportionate impact upon Scotland, where 70% of the wind farms in planning will be in Scotland. That's going to have a hugely detrimental impact on our ability to meet our climate change targets. And those targets will apply to the UK, which is seeking to play a leading role in the Paris talks this year. So the sensible thing to do is to try and find some way of a compromise, I would say, that would allow this to happen in Scotland whilst keeping those in the Tory shires happy by not seeing more happen in England. Murdo Fraser, do you see a compromise on the horizon?
No, I don't. This was a clear manifesto commitment from the Conservatives. It was signalled well in advance, and it would be a betrayal of many rural communities across Scotland who, as we saw in your package, have been rejoicing that we have a Conservative government delivering on its manifesto pledges.
Now,
so
in fairness, the manifesto did say you would end the subsidies to onshore wind farms, but the government has decided to end them a year earlier than was promised in the manifesto, so that is a change.
No, that's not actually quite correct. What you're talking about is the end to the renewable obligations, which were due to end in 2017. The government's brought that on to 2016. What the government said was very clear, and Michael Fallon, the then Energy Minister, said in April of last year, April 2014, that any projects that did not have planning consent and grid connection at the time of the general election would not get any subsidies going forward. In fact, Amber Rudd, the Secretary of State at DEC, has been a little bit more generous than that and has extended that date to the 18th of June 2015. So it's not true to say we're closing this off early. It's entirely in line with everything we predicted. And let's put this in context. The respected Scottish economist Tony Mackay has calculated that the level of wind subsidies paid to what are in the main multinational companies was between 2.5 and 3 times higher than they should have been. Now that is profiteering, in his words, super profits made very often by multinational companies at the expense of consumers who are paying through their electricity bills at a time when 40% of Scottish households are suffering from fuel poverty. So here we have a Conservative government standing up for communities and standing up for those who are struggling to pay their bills.
Callum McKay, do you accept that this was signalled at the general election, that anything that didn't have planning permission by then wouldn't get a subsidy?
I think to say that there were mixed messages being sent out to the industry would be putting it mildly. The manifesto said that they would end new subsidies. This is not ending new subsidies. This is ending those that were already in the pipeline that major companies put significant investment into because they were told by a Conservative-led government that they would meet their commitments under the renewables obligation. This isn't so much moving the goalposts as ripping up the entire pitch.
But Callum McKay,
investment in renewables.
These companies that were planning major wind farm developments, these are plans that are going to last for years and years and years. Why should it make such a difference to them if the renewables obligation ends 12 months early, when they must be looking at a 15, 20-year investment in these wind farms?
Yeah, but there's a particularly long lead-in time. It takes several years, potentially up to 10 years from conception to delivery for these to come forward. So there will be projects that have been in the pipeline for some time, and because they've fallen just the wrong side of a rather arbitrary date set by the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, there's potentially tens, if not more, of millions of pounds that will go to waste. Now, the Tories are meant to be pro-business. I can understand that they might be anti-wind, but you would have at least thought they would want to see sunk investment actually bring a return to those who've invested in it, rather than go completely and utterly to waste. And by the way, over and above that, if we're not going to have onshore wind and we are going to meet our climate change targets, it's going to be more expensive for the consumers. The head of Scottish Power's renewable wing has said that cost could ultimately be £2 to £3 billion more if we have to use other forms of carbon-free energy production. This is bad policy done in a completely slapdash, haphazard way.
Murdo Fraser, you don't look convinced.
Well, I don't really know where to start with all that. Well, of course, power companies will be making super profits. Super profits. You should be apologising for the super profits made by foreign-owned multinational companies at the expense of the fuel poor in Scotland. What we need is a balanced energy policy. The SNP have got this obsession with onshore wind.
What's in
Thank goodness, because a Conservative government in the UK
Fracking,
standing up
nuclear,
for those who are paying their bills, standing up for those who are paying their bills, and standing up for communities across Scotland who have been abandoned by the SNP.
So, Callum McKay,
utter nonsense.
If it's so good for Scotland to have this investment from the wind farm companies, but it's not going to be coming from the UK government anymore, can the Scottish government replace it?
No, the funding, the entire energy market is regulated through Westminster. There was meant to be a formal consultory role for the Scottish Government through the Smith Commission proposals, but even that was watered down in the debate on the Scotland Bill. There is a desperate attempt to basically cut renewables. We're seeing the Green Investment Bank being sold off. We're seeing investment in subsidies drastically cut at very short notice, and we're seeing things like insulation schemes and the Green Deal being rolled back on. This government is trying to claim it's the greenest government ever, which is utterly absurd, quite frankly.
I think that was the last
and
government
it's also
that
saying
claimed
that it's going to play... I think David Cameron said that again today, is my understanding. And when we go with that into Paris, when we're going to try and strut on the world stage and play a leading role in cutting climate change, people are going to look at what we're saying and say to the UK, guys, you need to get your house in order before you start dictating to the rest of us how we should do things.
Murdo Fraser, is this government fundamentally anti-renewables or anti-onshore wind? Is this designed to try and stop the development of onshore wind farms?
Well, we still see a role for onshore wind as part of a balanced energy mix. But, we've got a target, a very ambitious target in Scotland to have 100% renewable electricity by 2020. If all the wind farms that are now being built, have already been constructed or in planning are built, we will have met that target. It makes no sense to be pouring additional sums in public subsidy, 2.5 to 3 times what the market justifies, which has to be paid by every household and every business in this country into this technology when we are already meeting our targets.
Okay.
What we do need is a properly balanced energy policy. We're going to have low carbon energy. The cheapest and most reliable way of providing base load is new nuclear power, cheaper and more reliable than intermittent renewables.
And
but we need a balance.
that's a topic for another day, I'm afraid.
And
Murdo Fraser, Callum McCaig, thank you both very much for that.